Welcome back, everyone. This week we're going to be shifting gears. Up until now, we've been reading fiction that was written either for adults or for audiences of unidentified ages. This week we're going to be reading a work of children's fiction we're going to be reading J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, or Peter and Wendy, as it's sometimes titled. Now, when we think about literature, by default, we tend to think about literature that's been written for adults. But children's fiction is a major branch of literature. In fact, it's one of the few branches of literature that is consistently read by mixed age audiences. Because you obviously have children reading children's literature, you oftentimes have adults reading children's literature for pleasure. For example, adults will pick up J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. And then in addition, you oftentimes have adults reading fiction to children. Now, when people think about children's fiction, they tend to think about it as being simple or reductive. The stories tend to be shorter, the storyline may be a little bit simpler to follow, and unlike adult fiction, children's stories are oftentimes accompanied by illustrations. But far from simple, children's fiction is actually incredibly complex, which is why I wanted to read a work of children's fiction this week. So, children's fiction actually relies on the exact same rhetorical strategies that we find in adult fiction. It uses metaphor, it relies on diction and grammar, character, setting, um, imagery, tropes in order to make meaning. Uh, Children's literature also may contain images in the form of illustrations. And if we're thinking about very young literature for very young children, it may not only contain images, it might also contain textures. It might even contain smells. I mean, how odd is that to think about one's literature as containing a smell or a texture? Now, these images, these textures, occasionally these smells, exist in relationship to the textual story that's going on. In some cases, we might find that images in children's stories are just meant to be sort of added onto the story. But in some cases, they actually are completely intertwined with the textual meaning of the story, such that if you don't have the image, then the story itself breaks apart. But there's another reason why children's fiction is so complicated. It's one that I want us to think about this week. And it's really an issue of audience. Children are a culturally valued group. It's a group that writers and readers they want to protect and amuse and to help raise. Now, since the mid 1700s, Western society has imagined children as innocent, as uncorrupted, and as imaginative. Think for a second about what your ideal image of children or childhood is, and it is probably something along these lines is, someone who is super innocent, someone who's very playful, someone who's very imaginative. And then when our culture thinks about ideal childhoods, it tends to be ones in which children can play freely, ideally outdoors, and play really without a lot of adult supervision or management. Now, this idea, or I should say rather, this ideal about children and childhood is actually culturally and historically contextual. That is, that there are historical moments where cultures don't think of children like this, but our particular culture happens to imagine children and childhood in these terms. As I said, this ideal about childhood sees its origins in the mid 1700s. It actually hits a high point in the early 1900s when J.M. Barrie was writing Peter Pan. So, in the early 1900s, what happens is you see a real ramping up of the ideal of childhood as a time of innocence, imagination, free play. So, what literature in the early 1900s begins to do is to reflect a sense of nostalgia for childhood as something that is almost Edenic. That it's something that is so innocent, so pure, as to be almost a kind of paradise. That is, that children's kind of imaginative worlds and experiences seem like a kind of paradise. And there's a sense in literature that childhood represents a world that is ultimately lost to adults. but is something that adults themselves both value and also desire to return back to. So, this is the culture in which J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan, which was published in England in 1911. I want to give you a little bit of background on J.M. Barrie himself. He was born in 1860 and he died in 1937. He was a writer and a public intellectual who wrote plays and fiction and gave talks. Um, Now, we know some of the literary sources for Barrie's Peter Pan. They come from, some of the incidents come from his own childhood, in particular, the reading material that he had as a child. He was really interested in reading something called penny dreadfuls, which were essentially cheap, like sort of dime store crime fiction that was really popular with young boys in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. He also, as a child, participated in amateur theatrical productions in his home, and he also had a lot of school experiences that he brought to bear on Peter Pan. But the more immediate impetus for the story actually comes from Barrie's friendship with the Llewellyn Davis family. In particular, his friendship with the mother, Sylvia Llewellyn Davis, and her 5 boys. In fact, Sylvia ended up dying, as did her husband. And after that, Barrie became guardians to the 5 boys. So, Peter Pan began as a series of tales that Barrie told to these boys in around 1897 when they were in Kensington Garden. Kensington Garden is a huge royal garden in the middle of London. Based on these stories, Barrie published a work of fiction called The Little White Bird in 1902. And he then began writing Peter Pan. Now, Peter Pan was originally a theatrical performance. It opened in London on the 27th of December in 1904 under the title of Peter Pan or the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. And it was a total smash hit in both Britain and America and was really praised for embodying, quote, the soul of a boy, essentially. And it became a Christmas theatrical tradition in England after that. Now, based on the success of that theatrical production, Barrie wrote Peter and Wendy and published it in 1911, which is what we're reading today. And what he does there is he actually expands the play into a full fledged fiction. Now, the story will probably feel pretty familiar to you if you've watched the Walt Disney animated version of Peter Pan or ever watched the films Neverland or Hook or, I don't know, even eaten Peter Pan peanut butter. Peter Pan is one of these stories that was so popular and remains so popular that it has just become kind of embedded in our culture. Now, Peter Pan, of course, is the story of a mythic boy who lives in Neverland and he never grows up. He spends his times going on adventures with a band of lost boys like himself. They hunt Indians and pirates, and they play pretend. One night, he flies into the nursery of Wendy Darling, and he convinces her to fly back to Neverland with him, in order to be a mother to the lost boys. And she travels with her 2 brothers. They go to Neverland. Now, Wendy and her brothers have a series of adventures in Neverland. Wendy eventually decides that they should go home. And then on their way home, they're captured by the famed Captain Hook, and they have to be rescued by Peter. So, as you're reading the story, I want you to think about how Barrie represents childhood. I mean, Peter Pan obviously comes to embody this idea that people have about childhood and what childhood is supposed to be. He is a celebration of childhood, um, as is sort of the children's experiences in Neverland. But I want you to think about whether or not Peter Pan really strikes you as the embodiment of a kind of playful or innocent childhood. Is he a purely good character? And if not, is there anything troubling to you about Peter Pan and about Neverland itself? All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll look forward to talking with you on the discussion board.